Hey everybody, welcome back to another installment of the Can We Please Talk podcast. As always, I'm Mike Leon.
And I'm Nick Severi.
Nikki, my friend, another episode. How are you, sir? How's everything going over there?
I'm good, man. I am 4 days removed from my second vaccination, so doing well.
That's good to hear, man. I am actually finally scheduled for my vaccine when we start heading back up to the New York area, so I'm very excited for that. Everything's going good, family. Everybody's good, healthy.
It was good. Yeah, my parents finally came over. It was a good reunion with the grandkids finally, so we're good. Excited, man. It's springtime, baby. Things are good up here.
That's right. Yeah, it's getting warmer, better weather, better times ahead, especially with everything going on with the vaccine rollout. We're going to transition into what I think is a pretty cool topic tonight, Nick. Let me ask you a question. Okay, I'm going to ask you a series of questions here. You tell me if you've ever done any of these. Mm-hmm. Have you ever climbed Mount Kilimanjaro?
Less than 0 times.
Less than 0 times. Okay. Have you ever gone to South Africa and run with the cheetahs?
No, actually, I'm a zebra person.
Oh, you're a zebra person. Okay. That's a great response, Nick. You ever help out with the penguins and the missions that are in Africa to help save penguins that are in rescue fires or in oil spills? Anything like that, Nick?
The only thing I do with penguins is I can do the penguin dance.
Okay. All right.
But, you know.
All right, corny. Okay, but listen.
Wow. All right.
I got to hit you with that because tonight we are going to learn how to explore, my friend. We have a legendary Emmy Award-winning producer, host of Born to Explore. You can check your local listings for when Born to Explore airs, but if you want to watch the episodes, you can watch them on demand on Amazon Prime. He's the host of the podcast Life's Tough, Explorers Are Tougher, and that is none other than Richard Wiese is going to be joining us tonight to really talk about how he became an explorer. You know, every week, we've been talking, Nick and I, we want to educate our audience on a different topic, an interesting topic, right? And offer a conversation about it. I know nothing about exploration, why people become explorers, and some of the missions behind actually exploring and some of the things that Richard does, especially with the Cheetah Conservation Society. So there's so much to the exploration game, but then also what's been happening with COVID. Travel has been limited. So how has that kind of impacted him? His podcast also is very interesting. Some of the people that he has had on in the exploration game, let's call it, for lack of a better term. Nick, I know you've watched some of Richard's content, especially some of the episodes from Born to Explore. What do you make of the topic overall and Richard's work?
I mean, it's extraordinary. I mean, we're talking about traveling the world. I know you're in the process of heading back to New York, right? You know, and I've done some traveling in my life, mostly before the kids were born. But Richard's an adventurer. That's actually what we're talking about. So, through him, we're talking about someone who has, just traveled through mountains, who's gone through all kinds of terrains, and really is a perfect example of like, what does Earth have to offer? And that sounds crazy to say it like that, but there's so many different areas. Like talking to him is almost like having someone just take you through the Planet Earth, series. I mean, he's been everywhere, literally.
Yeah, no, he has. I mean, let me give you some places he's been to: Chile, India, Namibia, Nepal, South Africa, Tanzania. He has been to so many different places, has done so many different things. And like I said, we're going to get into so much with him today because, I've traveled as well. I've been to Europe and things like that, in Canada, Mexico. But in terms of, seeing dangerous animals up close, specifically, he has been around cheetahs, zebras, mountain lions. I've never done any of that. You've never done any of that. The average person has probably never done any of that. Climbing Mount Kilimanjaro 11 times. So he didn't do it once. He did it 10 more times. And that thrill-seeking adventure, like, what is that like? What does that look like? He can kind of, let us in on the secret sauce of how you, get your body ready to do something like that. So we're very excited. I can't wait to talk to Richard today. All right, Nick, like we mentioned at the top, tonight's topic is really about exploration. There's nobody better than our next guest, and he is the host of Born to Explore on PBS. You can catch some of the episodes on demand on Amazon Prime. He's also the host of a fantastic podcast called Life's Tough, Explorers Are Tougher, and that is nobody better than Richard Wiese. Mr. Wiese, Mike Leon, Nick Severi, thank you so much for hopping on with us today.
Hi, guys. Great to be on. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for being with us. We really don't know anything about exploring. Nick and I work in tech. Nick is in education. So, before we get into the topic of exploration tonight, I would love for you to tell our audience a little bit more about yourself. Tell us about your upbringing and what made you want to get into adventure and exploration.
Well, I think you probably have done more exploring than you think because the main ingredient that all explorers have is curiosity. And one of the traits of explorers, too, are they're storytellers. So you guys are already in that business. I have a theory that ever since people came out of trees or out of caves, there was always that intrepid soul who was wondering what was beyond the ocean, lake, mountaintop. They'd come back, stand over a fire, and say, "You'll never guess what happened to me. You'll never guess what I saw." And then they said, "Can we please talk?"
I hope
That's
they
what I
said that and leave us a
Well,
review
I
too.
don't know about that, but I'd like to have some creative license with that.
Yeah.
So, the story of exploration really is the story of humankind. My own personal story comes with two very influential people in my life. One being my father, Richard Wiese. Also, he was the first man to solo the Pacific Ocean in an airplane. I was lucky; he was a Pan Am captain. He flew a 747, and the language I spoke with my father, he wasn't so much into sports, although I was. We talk about the weather. We'd stand out on the lawn, look at the sky. He knew celestial navigation. And the other big influence was my mother's brother, Dr. Richard Lanza, MIT nuclear physicist. And, he came from an immigrant background where my Italian relatives on his side, although smart, weren't educated. And, here's this guy who was a genius in a family. And he always had the time for me. And one of the things I always admired about my uncle, and still to this day, is that he could really speak in a layperson's terminology. He made everybody, whether it was a guy cleaning the streets, feel like he was talking to them and at their level, never patronizing. So he was the original science communicator in my life. And then, the other convergence of opportunity for me was I lived in an area with not a lot of kids, a lot of woods, beaches, and being inside really was something that happened when you were punished. And I was just outside, always exploring, digging for things, diving, just always doing that kind of stuff. I just always wanted to see more of the earth. I was lucky again to have another mentor. One of my sisters brought home a guy. They ended up not dating, but he was the town conservation officer who was building an artificial reef in the Long Island Sound. And he was like, "Hey, you want to help me go diving?" And I was so psyched to be brought into that kind of fold where I was out on a scuba project building an artificial reef. And it may not have been a big deal to him at the time, but man, I was just loving it. And then I got my education at Brown University. I was a science major. And, one thing led to another. And then uh, I guess, sometime in the mid 1980s, I found a place called the Explorers Club. When I was living in New York City, I used to love to go to lectures, hear really smart people in all different fields speak. And when I got to the Explorers Club, I was like, this is my tribe. These are my people. They could talk about places that I knew about, maybe had been, and their membership was unbelievable. It was like the first men to the North Pole, first to the South Pole, first guys on the moon. I mean, for me, going into the clubhouse they had on the Upper East Side of Manhattan was like Harry Potter's Hogwarts. It was magic. I heard people talking about magic. The only thing is, they really did do those things. And then, one thing leads to another. I think that so much of my life, great things have come as a result of being a volunteer on many things. I met my wife through volunteering on something. I just, for whatever reason, in the Explorers Club, kept going up the ladder, and um, in 2002, I was elected the youngest president ever in the history of this club. And we're talking about a club with Theodore Roosevelt and Neil Armstrong and Jane Goodall. And then more recently in 2018, I was elected for a second set of terms. And at this point, I've been the longest serving president in its 117-year history. And that organization has given me the opportunity to just meet my childhood heroes. And so, the idea of having a television show or a podcast or radio show, man, that's just fun. It's going places that I like going, and it's talking to people I want to talk to, and it's a subject that I'm very enthusiastic about. And I know that's a long-winded answer. So
No, it's the best answer. Actually. So Richard, thinking of yourself as the explorer who you are now in 2021, you think about when you first made your trek out there, and you talked about growing up and just what does exploring mean just in real time for you. But when you set off on your course to start really traveling the world, what would you say back to that person who first took their first step and started venturing out into places just undreamed of?
Well, an interesting thing happens to guys. Like the first time I climbed Mount Kilimanjaro, I was 11 years old. And so that's pretty old. Pretty young to do something like that. Because when I look at kids where I live, and I actually have two 11-year-old boys, kids today are raised like little veals in sort of, protected crates, milk fed, and they don't, do things that adventurous without a lot of supervision. But I think where life started changing for me is when I got married, had kids. I had a very socially conscious wife from South Africa who'd start the Africa Foundation when she was like 21 years old. And so my journey became less about me rushing to the top of a mountain or diving someplace and beating my chest. And I became more interested in the people that lived in these places and the stories that they had to tell. I think that you become a vastly more interesting person because it's not the ego or trying to always prove something. And so I think that what I would say to my younger self is it's not all about you. And as soon as you figure out that it's not about you, you actually become a better you.
Right. Richard, before you came on, we were talking about some of the places you've traveled to, Chile, India, Tanzania, just some crazy places. You mentioned South Africa and you met your wife there. I think the episode I was watching recently, you were doing something with the penguins in South Africa and that place that helps out penguins that have been under distress or are found in the oil spillages. I'm curious as to, and I'm sure everybody who would be listening to this, watching this, what's something that is crazy to the common person that's happened on these adventures that maybe wasn't shown on the show, something that had happened to you where you're like, I can't believe that just happened to us right now.
Yeah. There's always the behind the scenes that when the camera stops and, the crew I traveled with, I thought was always very socially conscious film crew. I filmed hundreds of episodes with the same people. And when the camera's off and you're sitting around instead of what would be typically thought of a film crew doing, they were talking about the experience or the person they met or what they had just seen. But I think that, people will always ask you your best this or that favorite place. That's very hard to say, but there are a couple experiences that are so big that even if you're not religious, you just can't help but feel there's something bigger. And the two things that come top of mind are seeing a really great aurora borealis, the northern lights. And I could just see how people in the northern climates in the Arctic would have, found God in that. It's just when you see these lights just dancing and changing shapes and, just the snow glowing from those things, it's just on a whole other level of surreal. I think I was lucky a few years ago to get hired by CNN to do coverage of the eclipse, which a lot of people, that was a great day for citizen science. But in that moment of totality, the 100% eclipse, suddenly something happens. 99% is interesting. 100% is, first of all, the Earth and the Moon. The fact that they're almost exactly the same size. Nowhere else in the known universe that happens. That the apparent size of the Moon and the Sun are the same. So when they crisscross, this perfect dome. But the temperature, it's like somebody suddenly dropped the temperature 15 degrees and literally turned a light switch out, and you suddenly see stars around where the sun was. And I had enough presence of mind to know that I wanted to see Mercury, because you almost never see Mercury in the sky, and I could see it next to the sun. But I could see how an ancient civilization or group would have honestly thought the world was ending. It just seems so bizarrely wrong. And then, obviously big animal migrations are great. And then I've just had experiences with people who have overcome the most incredible obstacles. Africa always comes to mind, because I've always been so impressed by the creativity of people there and how they find joy when so many other things had been taken away from them, that they're able to still find a bunch of bottle caps and create something totally creative. And that tells me a lot about the human spirit.
Richard, you're a perfect person to ask this question to. What does your bucket list look like, considering everywhere you've been and everything you've done? What remains on it?
Well, when you travel a lot and there is no person who's been everywhere. And I once met this guy who's very anxious to meet me, because he had visited every country in the world in something like a 15-month period. And he was so impressed with that. And I thought to myself, this is actually pathetic, because what did he actually see other than an airport, get his passport stamped, and moved on? And so what I find is that there are social, cultural events that happen in so many places in the world that are so profoundly moving. I could take places in the United States that are even urbanized. For example, I was filming in New York City. I wanted to do something or portray New York City in a way that people hadn't seen. And that's a pretty tall order, right? So I got a really good friend of mine, Ken LaCavera. He's a paleontologist. He discovered the largest dinosaur ever. And we decided we were going to go fossil hunting in all 5 boroughs and take in cultural events. So we went foraging with some guy in Central Park. I did some stuff with the Hasidic Jews in Brooklyn. In Queens, I did something with a Korean dance troupe. And so I took in all these wonderful cultural aspects, and we went fossil hunting to boot. And I thought that was a pretty great day. And then you could go to some place like Nashville, Tennessee, and there's something in the water there that has created a type of music and vibe. And that may not sound like a far-flung adventure, but if you think about all the languages spoken on Earth, it's probably about 6,000 spoken. The languages of art, music, dance, food, nature are all international nonverbal languages that we all share. I could sit across from somebody in India, share a meal, not speak the language, but somehow come to some sort of understanding and appreciation of their culture and how they do things in life.
Richard, obviously we talked about all these places that you've traveled to, and with the global pandemic last year and of course into this year, and how has that really hurt your travel schedule, filming for the show? What are some things that you have done to kind of, supplant that, or at least, fill that itch? I know it's tough to do it in a virtual world, but over Zoom, like we're doing this podcast. So how have you been able to adjust to not being able to travel?
Well, I mean, first of all, who knew what Zoom was a year and a half ago? And the fact that we're looking at each other and speaking to us, I think it's really great. It so beats a phone call, right? Because you actually see the nonverbal communication of a person. And so I've gotten a chance to meet a lot of people, especially explorers that, I might see their name in print or meet them at a cocktail party, shake hands, and and, kind of have cocktail party talk. So I think that people have gotten the time to meet some people, uh, vis-a-vis that. My family, I live in Connecticut. I have 3 children and, a wife, and, we started having a ritual around a fire pit outside, and that was really wonderful. Obviously, from a, financial standpoint, I can't film any of these places, but, that's a finite time. And at the Explorers Club, there were certain things we did. We got to look at ourselves critically and say, who do we want to be? And I had the time to meet with people and large groups of people. And I just want to tell you a quick story of something we're so proud of. Um, about, oh, I guess right at the beginning of the pandemic, someone had said, "Hey, you got to see this poem called Earthrise. It's about this from this young poet named Amanda Gorman, and that it talks about the Apollo 8 people and what they saw." And so here I see this young woman just giving the most, you know, unbelievable performance about this. And I said, I've got to, write to her and say, "Hey, listen, you're reaching a whole group of people who would never have thought about the moon or the Apollo 8 um, mission." So we had a correspondence, and I asked her if she'd like to be a member of the Explorers Club. And she was like, "Wow, it's unbelievable." She goes, "I can't afford it." I said, "Don't worry, I'll pay for your membership." And we started a nice correspondence. But then I thought, how many Amanda Gormans are out there? People who you'd have no idea who they were, who are communicating nature or research. And so we started this program called the Explorers Club 50. And the slogan I made up was 50 people who are changing the world that the world needs to know about. And one of the criteria was that you couldn't be a well known explorer. And so that took a lot of self-serving nominations out of there. And we had 400 and something nominations from our members. The way it just sort of ended out was we had Inuit people, we had Native American people, we had a marine biologist from Sri Lanka. I had several people from India who were experts on things. And it was such a wonderfully diverse group of people. And I got them all together on a Zoom call, at least 35 out of the 50. And they all did like a minute at the mic. And they were just all so blown away by other people kind of like them. And I thought, this is such a wonderful idea for the Explorers Club, which is mostly perceived as a older white male organization. And I thought, out of all the great reasons to do something like the selfish reason of making it a more interesting place, or at least a more interesting place for the Explorers Club to be. And so I said, the Explorers Club should be a platform for anybody who believes in the religion of science and exploration. And so we took it another step forward, and we did an LGBTQT seminar, which was really interesting. That was again a group of people who didn't have the freedom to fully express themselves because of fear of a lot of things. And I just had one on last Monday night about exploring disabilities, and I spoke to a guy who got certified in scuba diving, who is paralyzed from the neck down. And so we did this in an authentic and organic way. It's not like we had a focus group come in and say you ought to do this. And I'm just so pleased how embraced how the club embraced this kind of change, and the idea of having a real world exploration center that is made up with a lot of different kinds of people. And so that was one of the joys of the pandemic. I wouldn't wish the pandemic again on anybody, but the idea of any crisis is to come out of it better than when you started.
You're speaking, obviously, Richard, to inclusion, and the examples you share speak to just the ability to advance diversity in a space and exploring that often is considered a white space. Richard, going forward, what do you hope for the Explorers Club to further that opportunity to make the conversation, the idea of exploring, more attainable, more just realistic to people of color, and in general in the world of adventuring?
It's a good question. And so I think the one aspect of the question that wasn't included was inclusion, because one of the aspects I've come to realize in self-examination is to say, and I'll just use race as for example. People live in, enclaves. I live in a place called Weston, Connecticut. Beautiful place in Connecticut, about an hour and 15 minutes out of New York City. Very wealthy, very white. And to the T, almost anybody will say, "Hey, I don't care if a black family moves next to me or an Asian family." And so that's not enough, because you have to ask yourself, why don't I see wealthy black or Asian families moving here now? They can afford to live there. So what is it about what they feel or the lack of vibe when they come to my town? And so, a now friend of mine who's the head of our diversity and inclusion person, a solo hiker named J.R. Harris, who's a very wise man. He's an African American guy from Queens. Said to me when he used to come to the Explorers Club, he'd sort of stand in a corner, didn't feel super welcome. And, um, you know, part of it was maybe him, and part of it was that people weren't extending. So I think that when we bring in new members, white, black, green, or purple, you have to make them feel part of that family. And that sort of goes into, how do you run an organization? How do you let people see that there are other people like them? For example, I know a guy in Rockaway Beach. This is off Long Island by Kennedy Airport. There's housing projects all over there. They're right on the ocean. And so this guy started something called the Black Surfers Association, because you have thousands of kids, African American kids, who never go near the water. And so why? Not because it's far, it's right there. They just don't know anybody like them who does that. And so, you know, if you take that to exploration, part of the Indiana Jones kind of story was a guy like me would go to some far flung country, bring back objects, and say, hey, Nepal is like this and the people are like that. The mind shift now is that you want cultures to tell their own story. And so I think we're getting there. For a lot of reasons. I think, again, uh, even though explorers are very alpha driven people, um, really tough nosed, I think they all realize that idea that great ideas emanate from all corners. Um, they, just because you're poor doesn't mean you're stupid and you don't see the world around you and you don't notice things. There is wisdom from every place. I mean, let's face it. If you're going to New York City, do you want a guide from Germany or do you want a guide from New York City? If you're going to Tanzania, who do you want your guide to be? You want a guide, the local guide. So, that's my dream for the Explorers Club, that they'll continue to grow, um, that people will start believing in science, and science is what made humanity thrive. It took us out of caves to permanent residence. And, I believe that science may have made a mess of the world, or humans have, but it's maybe going to save us too.
Richard, of all the things that you have done, I talked about it before with the stuff that you did with the penguins. I know how much you work with the cheetahs and the conservation for cheetahs. What has been the most fulfilling part of some of these episodes that you filmed, or some of the work that you've done with the Explorers Club?
So with the Explorers Club, again, things of recent for me that have been very satisfying, is that diversity inclusion group, bringing people who may not have known about it or could afford to it. We also, again, just days before the pandemic started, we got Discovery to ink a $1 million a year grant program that makes the Explorers have is a significant player in giving field grants to people. So I felt really good about that. And then, when I'm filming, what also makes you feel good is that when you can lend voice to a group that many people don't know about. And I remember once visiting a Berber village high in the Atlas Mountains, and I said to them at the end, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And the guy said, um, "We don't have blankets for everybody here in the winter." And I said, "What would it cost to get, whatever amount you need?" Ended up being like $500, but good I felt. And we didn't film this or talk about it. I just bought the village enough blankets to make their day or night better. And so, this small acts of kindness like that, that you feel really good about it. And, whilst you might say I am giving them something material, what I took away was so much greater.
Richard, you're hitting on, just humanitarian efforts. When we think of the Explorers Club, and to your point, it's no longer about taking and sort of checking things off the list, but what is the contribution back to humanity, just to the planet itself? And something I want to hear is, for people like Mike and myself, our adventures right now are primarily with our kids, and obviously the same for you too. But what are the opportunities for just all of us, beyond traveling, but just to make a difference in the world? What are potentially organizations you'd recommend, or just efforts that we can all do to be more mindful of the planet moving forward?
Yeah. So right now, at least America is suffering from nature deficit disorder. Like, I'm an outdoorsy guy, and I have a hard time getting my boys off of their video games. We're in the first time in history that it was more interesting for kids anywhere in the world to be inside than outside. It was punishment when I was a kid. And so when you are dealing in this fantasy world, you don't have compassion because you're not, everything is illusionary, a mountain, a group of people, an animal. And so the best thing anybody can do, if you have kids, like one of my favorite things to do with my kids is that I like going at low tide to these giant tidal pools that are, at least where I am in Connecticut, they're all over the country if you live on the coast. And we go tide pooling. And the great thing about low tide is it's a short period. There really are no rules because there's nothing you can break. You just have to be respectful to nature. Maybe my kids kick a soccer ball around or make a little crab fortress out of sand. Maybe I just take pictures. But I feel that I after that moment feel more vested in that natural part of the world. And so you don't have to be a great explorer to explore. When you stand out and you look at the stars or the sun and trees and you plant things, those are all things that contribute to a greater good. Not everybody has that capacity, but we all have the capacity to enjoy the things right outside our doorstep and make that better.
Richard, before we let you go, obviously you mentioned podcasting. You're on a podcast,
Yep.
so you have your own.
Sure.
Life's tough. Explorers are tougher. So tell us a little bit about that podcast and how it's been being a podcaster.
It's fun because the commute is great, and so mine is I'm just calling up friends. I had recently Kathy Sullivan, first American woman to walk in space. I had another guy named Victor Vescovo, is the first person to dive to the deepest point in every ocean. I've had a guy who was the inspiration for Red October. He's a nuclear sub captain. What's and I feel like in every field, people have a common language. If you get a bunch of photographers around, you get podcasters, people talk a certain language. I know these people's language. And so it's more than just idol worship, like, wow, that's so cool. I kind of know the path that they've been on and the direction. And so I've really enjoyed it because it's a conversation among friends. I think with podcasting, the challenge is versus taping something is you've got to get a guest up to speed right out of the gates. Otherwise, you don't want to spend 3/4 of the interview just getting the person to be to the point where you wanted them to start. So that's a little bit of a challenge. But and as you can tell, I'm a bit of a talker, so it's a good exercise to be a listener and react off of their questions. But I'm enjoying it. To where all these podcasts go, who knows? But it's kind of fun to have conversations that you'll think about afterwards.
That is very well said. That's exactly why we started this show, to learn about some interesting topics and have thoughtful dialogue about it.
You guys got great podcast voices. I have to tell you right off the bat. And, both
very
of you
kind. Thank
for
you,
TV,
sir.
maybe.
Well, I mean, I've worked in television for 20
I
years.
can tell, man. You got it going there.
Nick has done local radio as well. We both were School of Journalism communication majors from Rutgers. So we appreciate that. That will be the soundbite that we use, obviously. You can check out Life's Tough, Explorers Are Tougher, wherever you get your podcasts. You can also check out Born to Explore, folks. I just watched season 3 on Amazon Prime, but you could check it out on PBS or check your local listings. Richard Wiese, thank you so much for being on the program tonight, sir. All the best to you and your family. Stay safe and continued success.
Oh, thank you very much. You guys were a lot of fun. I enjoyed the experience.
All right. That was Richard Wiese. Like I mentioned, Born to Explore. Check your local listings. You can find those episodes. You can check them out on Amazon Prime. The season 1 through 3 is there. The podcast, like I mentioned, Life's Tough, Explorers Are Tougher. A fantastic series. If you really want to learn what some of these people, and he mentioned it's a bunch of his friends, but what some of these people in this field do, it's a great podcast to learn about. Nick, what'd you think of some of the stuff that Richard told us about, just that maybe you do have that ability to be an explorer, an adventurer inside of you. And he talked about, it's typically, there's not that much diversity in the exploration adventure game, and they're trying to work on diversity and inclusion. I thought some of that stuff was really interesting. What'd you make of Richard and everything that he's doing?
This might be the first time where I've gone into an interview where I have a lot of preconceived notions about this person. Because when I think about explorers, I think about people, who do the voiceovers for all these nature programs and stuff. Right. And they can be, they can be a little just like stodgy, I guess is the word I'm thinking about. They're brilliant people. They're very, worldly, but they're not going to kind of speak at you from just sort of like a person to person, just from like hey, we're just two people talking. And Richard did that. I think you hit it on a moment ago, but the concept of just basic ways to explore. He talks about just simple ways that he's doing that with his kids, trying to do that, coming out of the pandemic, and opportunities for any of us, you and I obviously with kids as well. This concept of adventuring is more attainable than we think. And here's a guy who's currently the president of the Explorers Club telling us it's not so much what you all thought. It's not about getting all over the world and having to film all these documentaries, which he obviously does and does great programming, but it's something that lives right outside your door. So
right.
he made exploring very attainable, and that was something I was not anticipating in this conversation. So I was blown away by just how approachable he was and how practical he was about adventuring and just being a traveler.
Now, I'm telling you, if you go onto Amazon Prime now, folks, and check out the seasons, I was able to watch a couple episodes recently. I was just blown away by, first off, I'm enamored with travel and seeing him in South Africa. And there was something there, like I mentioned, with rescuing penguins that have been through oil spillages and what they do in the process. And he really takes the time to explain a lot of this stuff. He's done a lot, in the cheetah conservation space. I learned recently that cheetahs could become extinct within the next 15 to 20 years. So just factoids like that, when you're learning about, some of these animals or some of the places that he travels to. He's talked about some of the personal stories. So check out everything that Richard's doing. Check out that podcast, Life's Tough, Explorers Are Tougher, and Born to Explore. Just check your local listings or head to Amazon Prime. You can watch the episodes. Speaking of episodes you can watch, you head over to YouTube. Nick's pointing down, smashing the subscribe button for our video watchers, audio, all the podcast platforms, Apple, Spotify, Google, recently launched on Amazon Music. So just say, Alexa, play Can We Please Talk podcast, and it should come right up.
It works.
As always, I am Mike Leon.
And I'm about to go talk to Alexa to hear my voice back at me, Nick Saveri.
Don't forget to check us out, IG, Twitter, TikTok, at Can We Please Talk Podcast. Thanks, everybody.